very much for coming to our meeting. In fact, he shifted the schedule to make it here, so thank you very much. So today is going to talk about a very hot topic, fair ordering. And thank you. Okay, people camping at the back. Be the first to raise their hand. How's this? Okay, is this better? Yes, great. Okay, I'm going to talk about the fair ordering of transactions in blockchain systems, why we need it, why it's important, and how we get it. And I'm going to spend about half the talk discussing why and half the talk discussing how. Yep. Well, blockchains are really meant to be a repudiation of Wall Street and the way that it has skewed the financial playing field. You'll recall that Bitcoin was born in the midst of the 2008-2009 financial meltdown. And enshrined in its genesis block is a critique of the way that central banks responded to that crisis. Blockchains are supposed to be different. They're supposed to provide fairness and transparency. This ethos, I think, is well captured in this sort of rhapsodic quote here from the Tapscots in a book published some 5 years ago. But this vision of fairness and transparency hasn't quite come to pass. And I'm going to talk about one important respect in which it hasn't been realized because of two unfortunate facts about permissionless blockchains. The first unfortunate fact is that transactions are publicly visible. If Alice wants to submit a transaction to buy some token, let's say Bob's bubble token, to a blockchain like Ethereum, she has to send it into a public mempool. Once it's in the mempool, it's visible to everyone, including those who may want to take advantage of it for dubious purposes. That's unfortunate fact number one. Unfortunate fact number two is that despite the fact these systems are decentralized, the ordering of transactions itself is in fact centralized. There's this paradox at the heart of current blockchain designs. This is to say that when a collection of transactions enter the mempool and are taken up by a validator or miner, the miner, just refer to this entity as a miner, the miner gets to decide how these transactions are ordered in a block and can even insert its own transactions. So for instance, transactions may come in the order red, may be inserted into the mempool in the order red, green, blue. If the miner decides that it wants to flip the green and the blue transactions, it can do that. And it can do it unilaterally. So again, it's up to the miner how these things get ordered. Okay, well, I present these two unfortunate facts. So what? In what respect are they unfortunate? I think the best way to explain this is by way of an example. So let's suppose that Alice submits her transaction. As I said, she wants to buy some Bob's bubble token. And let's suppose that the current price is 1 ETH per bubble token on a decentralized exchange. If all goes well and there are no competing transactions, Alice will get, for her 1,000 ETH, exactly 1,000 Bob's bubble tokens. Now, as an effect of her making this purchase, the price of Bob's bubble tokens will rise. You place a buy order for bubble tokens, their price rises. Now, let's suppose that a miner observes that Alice has submitted this transaction. Right? After all, it's taking up this transaction, putting in a block. What the miner can do is mount what's known as a sandwich attack. In this type of attack, the miner inserts its own transactions, one before Alice's and one afterwards. And now let's look at what happens. The miner's transaction goes in. The miner buys a bunch of Bob's bubble token because the miner knows that the next transaction, it's sequenced the transactions after all, is Alice buying bubble token. And when Alice buys bubble token, the price will rise. So the miner can now turn around and sell the bubble token it has just acquired at a profit. What's the impact of this ordering of transactions? Alice is out 25 BBT. Where has her loss gone? It's gone into the pocket of the miner. So you can think of the miner as having basically picked Alice's pocket. Miners can do this. It's also possible for bots, entities other than miners, to do this. And I'll talk a little bit about how bots can achieve the same goal. We first documented this activity and did a measurement study of it in a paper entitled Flashbots 2.0, reference to the famous Michael Lewis book, Flashbots. And in that paper, we coined a term for the assets that ordinary users are kind of leaving on the table for miners. We refer to it as miner extractable value, or MEV. Some people have embraced the alternative term maximal extractable value, but of course the acronym remains the same. At the time that we conducted the study, this was in 2019, 2020, this was what I refer to as the era of the MEV bot wars. So at this time, miners really weren't in on the game. Bots instead were competing with one another and playing with transaction fees to affect the ordering of transactions in blocks. They were competing with one another to pick users' pockets. All of this has changed. Now, bots are actively colluding with miners or validators. And in fact, there are off-chain marketplaces and auctions for MEV, for these opportunities to take advantage of users' transactions. Much of this is thanks to Flashbots, a system that now enjoys the participation of, I think it's well over 90% of miners, soon to be validators in Ethereum. And Flashbots is evolving in various ways. The important point here is that extraction of MEV, capitalization, the process of capitalizing on the two unfortunate facts I mentioned is rampant, and it's becoming increasingly institutionalized. If you want to know how widespread it is, Flashbots, in fact, provides a very nice dashboard where they show you just how much has been taken from users. We're approaching something like 700 million all told. This is a lower bound. It's considerably more than this. It's considerably more than this in decentralized systems, DEXs as they're called, decentralized exchanges. And you also have to realize that DEXs are just the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. And I mean that in a literal sense. Right? 90% of an iceberg is below water. 1/1000th of all trading volume, cryptocurrency trading volume, when I last looked, is on DEXs. The rest is in centralized exchanges. Right? I guess we can call them sexes. I don't know what people call them for short. Okay. Well, there you've got about $50 billion a day in volume. It fluctuates quite a bit. And they're lightly regulated at this point. We have no idea what's going on in those exchanges. So there's almost certainly some kind of malfeasance going on, at least in certain corners of the world of centralized exchanges. I think it's also important to put a human face on this phenomenon, to think of MEV not just as an abstraction, but in terms of the harm that it's doing users. In our paper, we included some pleas by users who had lost money to bots posted in public fora like Etherscan. Here, please, 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 this is an accident, mistaken transaction, tried to cancel it, bot front ran him. I'm a single parent trying to make ends meet. Please have some mercy. There are many, many of these. The one that, to me, was most disturbing was this one. Right? Rajesh gathered up all the village rupee to make a trade, and some bot front ran him. And one shudders to think about what happened to him. Okay, well, what can we do about this? We probably can't eliminate all harmful MEV. In fact, at this point, we don't even have a good characterization of what is good versus bad MEV. But we can build tools, I would contend, that can help users. And we can make things fairer. And let me describe a couple of techniques that I think will come into play as we try to shift the playing field little bit more in favor of ordinary users. All right. One technique is known as secure causal ordering. The intuition is quite simple. Transactions are ordered not by a single validator or miner, but by a committee, and the committee orders these transactions while they're encrypted. Okay, so the idea is transactions go into the mempool in encrypted form, the committee gets together, figures out how to order them, and only once they've been ordered do they get decrypted, do they get revealed. This is very nice, and you can see how it's beneficial. Right? It's hard to take advantage of a transaction if you don't know its contents. Okay? I've seen at least several blockchain projects that believe that they invented this technique. Turns out it was actually invented back in 1993 by Mike Reiter and Ken Berman, and translated to, importantly, to the public key domain by Christian Kashan, who's sitting right here. Right? So this technique is very powerful, but it does have some limitations. One is that it exposes metadata. For example, you may know where a transaction came from, even if you don't know what it was, and that can tell you a lot. Second, it doesn't prevent certain types of attack, right? Suppose an NFT, popular NFT is dropping, CryptoPunks 2.0. Everyone wants one. So some rogue committee member wants her transaction to be first after the drop is initiated. Well, there's nothing about secure causal ordering that prevents that from happening. Okay? So very powerful, but has some limitations. An alternative approach that my group has been exploring, and in particular my student Mahimna Kelkar, who's sitting right there, has been spearheading this work. An alternative notion is temporal order fairness. Here too, the intuition is pretty clear. What we'd like to do basically is run a deli counter. Okay? But it's a distributed deli counter. We'll still make use of a committee to order transactions. In what sense is it a deli counter? Well, we're going to serve transactions, as it were. We're going to serve users on a first come, first served basis. You know how you go to a deli counter and you grab a ticket with a number and you're served according to the number you have. We want to do something like that, right? Because that's a fair form of processing for transactions. So the idea here is that transactions are submitted to all nodes in the committee, or all nodes in the committee pick them up from a mempool. They vote on how these transactions should be ordered according to their observation of when they came in, and then they output a definitive order. As I said, this is also intuitively clear, but it turns out to be fairly tricky to achieve because of something known as the Condorsay paradox. It comes from social choice theory. Suppose that Alice, Bob, and Carol are each running a node here. And suppose that Alice sees transaction 1, then transaction 2, then transaction 3. Let's suppose that Bob sees the same transactions, but in a different order. He sees transaction 2, then transaction 3, then transaction 1. And of course, Carol sees the same transactions, but in yet another order. She sees transaction 3, then 1, then 2. Well, I said they're going to vote on how these things get ordered. Suppose they vote on how pairs of transactions get ordered. Well, Alice and Carol both believe that transaction 1 should come before transaction 2. That's what they saw. To put it another way, a majority of nodes saw 1 before 2. Okay, this is well and good. A majority of nodes also saw transaction 2 before transaction 3. Okay, well, that's good. But here's the kicker. A majority of nodes also saw transaction 3 before transaction 1. So it turns out that, in fact, there is no way to order these transactions that is going to be compliant with all majority votes. Or to put it another way, any one of these 3 orderings is as good as the other 2. There's no good way to come up with a definitive ordering just based on the pattern of voting. We refer to a collection of transactions that get entangled in this way as a Condorsay cycle. And this is the hard part in achieving temporal ordering, dealing with these Condorsay cycles. There's some good news and some bad news about Condorsay cycles. Let me start with the bad news. I showed you an example of a length 3 Condorsay cycle. It turns out that Condorsay cycles can be arbitrarily long. They can basically go on forever, or almost forever. Right? That's the bad news. But there's some offsetting good news. Right? One is that, and I won't be able to talk about this in detail, but if you group the transactions in a Condorsay cycle in a batch, you treat them as equal in some sense, you can get a strong notion of fairness. The other nice thing is that we don't want transactions, in fact, we can't in a system like Ethereum or any other blockchain. We can't normally process transactions in parallel. We have to process them sequentially. So we actually need them ordered. Right? We can order transactions arbitrarily within a cycle without impacting this notion of fairness, which we call batch order fairness. It remains intact when we do that. So that's the other piece of good news. And finally, it turns out that in benign environments, when you don't have an adversary, just in an ordinary environment, Condorsay cycles are actually fairly rare. So in practice, you're not going to run up against a lot of them. And instead, you can have an authoritative ordering of all transactions, or nearly all transactions. Okay. We had a couple of results in this area of temporal transaction ordering. The first in a paper on a suite of protocols called Equitas family protocols. We don't get the 3f+1 that Christian was referring to in the last talk, but we get 4f+1, fairly close adversarial threshold. We enforce this notion of batch order fairness that I just referred to in the previous slide. Unfortunately, Equitas, in order to output the transactions in a Condorsay cycle, has to see the whole cycle. And as I said, cycles can be arbitrarily long. So you can get these delays in processing transactions. And so you don't get the standard notion of liveness that comes with most consensus protocols. You get a weaker notion that we refer to as weak liveness. The other thing about the Equitas protocols is that they make black box use of consensus protocol atomic broadcast, and consequently get pretty high asymptotic communication complexity, cubic complexity. So all in all, they're not practical. They're a proof of concept. And one of the contributions of this paper was defining the idea of temporal order fairness and showing that it could be achieved in a fairly strong sense. But we've had a recent result in the development of a system called THEMIS, which is based on the Equitas family protocols, where again, we get 4f+1, we get batch order fairness, but we're able to achieve standard liveness. The way that we do this is by gradually unspooling these Condorsay cycles, actually outputting transactions in a Condorsay cycle before we've seen the whole cycle. And some trickery was required to do that. We get very good communication complexity. In theory, linear. In practice, quadratic with a low constant. That's the quadratic one you would want to implement. And it turns out that indeed this is very practical. As we've shown in experiments, running the THEMIS protocol, for instance, atop hot stuff. We almost get the same performance as hot stuff. It's just that the computation is fairly expensive. So if you wanted to get really good performance, you would need to parallelize it. Or if you have nodes at a long distance from one another, maybe that network latency dominates and you don't need to worry about that. But in any case, it turns out to be very practical, and you can layer it on top of pretty much any leader-based consensus protocol, we believe. All I'm describing now is work that I've done on the academic side. I'm also chief scientist at a company called Chainlink, an Oracle company, builds what are called Oracle systems, deliver data to smart contracts. And I'd just like to mention that Chainlink is building a system called Fair Sequencing Services that uses this notion of temporal order fairness and combines it with secure causal ordering. It turns out that the two approaches are actually complementary and can be deployed in the same system. If you deploy them together, you get even stronger fairness assurances than if you deploy one or the other in isolation. And the idea here is to have an Oracle network serve as the committee I described that sequences transactions. It does this as a layer 2 service on behalf of a relying contract, which means that you don't need to make any modifications to the underlying blockchain to use something like this. You will need to modify a smart contract so that it knows to accept only the ordering asserted by this service, but you don't need to change the underlying blockchain or consensus protocol to make this work. That said, THEMIS is open source, code is available online, and we hope to see it widely used. There's been interest from other projects as well. Let me end here. Let me just mention that if you'd like to learn more, here's a short bibliography. But in addition, the students who've spearheaded all of this work are going to be giving talks over the next few days. So Phil Diane, who led the work on MEV, is going to be talking at the MEV workshop. Mahimna Kelkar, who led the work on temporal order fairness, is giving a talk at SBC on it and also at the MEV workshop. And Kushal Babel, who is one of the lead authors on a paper that seeks to characterize in a rigorous way using formal methods the amount of MEV available in a set of transactions, is going to be giving a talk at SBC on that piece of work. So you get to hear my outstanding students provide more details on everything that I've discussed today. Thank you very much.
Questions for Ari? Yes, okay.
If you're able to timestamp blocks. So blocks are in fact timestamped in most blockchains. That doesn't solve the problem. You can timestamp transactions, and there are alternative approaches to temporal order fairness that timestamp transactions and medianize the timestamps. They end up achieving a weaker notion of fair ordering, and in some cases also incur some liveness problems and so on and so forth, as we discuss in the THEMIS paper. Yeah. In the UTXO model, ordering really doesn't matter that much. So we're not concerned with this problem. We don't have to address it. Right? It's when you're processing transactions in smart contracts that the opportunity to mount things like sandwich attacks that I described arises. Yeah, the problem, as I understand it, in Bitcoin, for instance, is pretty minimal. Yeah. You really need a smart contract system layered on top for this to become problematic. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions for Ari? Yes.
So I know we're like very early days. But you might, I understand the miner wouldn't get as much value because they can't put stuff along. And so the sandwich where you can make the market price, there's some shared scheme. You still have that.
If you have smart contract-like functionality, then, as I was saying, the MEV problem can arise. Then it becomes significant. In Bitcoin, as it exists today, it's pretty minimal. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.